the decision that changed everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the federal courthouse in New Orleans as Judge J. Skelly Wright adjusted his black robes and prepared for what he knew would be the most consequential decision of his judicial career. It was May 16, 1960, and the weight of history pressed down on his shoulders like the humid Louisiana air. Judge Wright had been wrestling with the case of Bush versus Orleans Parish School Board for months. The legal arguments were clear. The constitutional precedent was established by Brown versus Board of Education 6 years earlier, but the practical implications were staggering. He was about to order the immediate desegregation of New Orleans public schools, knowing full well that his decision would ignite a firestorm that would consume the city. At 50 years old, Wright was no stranger to difficult decisions. Born in New Orleans and educated at Loyola University, he understood the deep cultural currents that ran through his hometown. He had seen the entrenched systems of segregation, witnessed the casual cruelty of Jim Crow laws, and observed how institutional racism had become woven into the very fabric of Southern society. Yet he had also sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that oath demanded he follow the law regardless of local sentiment. The courtroom was packed that Tuesday morning. Lawyers representing both sides of the desegregation case sat at their respective tables, while journalists from across the nation filled the gallery. The tension was palpable as Wright entered and took his seat behind the bench. "This court," Wright began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "has carefully considered all arguments presented in the matter of Bush versus Orleans Parish School Board. The Supreme Court of the United States, in Brown versus Board of Education, has clearly established that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some showed hope. Others barely contained rage. "The Orleans Parish School Board is hereby ordered to begin immediate desegregation of all public schools under its jurisdiction. This desegregation shall commence with the 1960 to 1961 school year and shall proceed with all deliberate speed as mandated by federal law." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the entire city. Judge Wright had just lit the fuse that would explode into one of the most dramatic confrontations between federal authority and local resistance in American history. The storm begins. The reaction to Wright's decision was swift and furious. By that evening, angry crowds had gathered outside the federal courthouse, their chants echoing through the French Quarter. "Impeach Wright," they screamed. "Federal tyranny." The local newspapers ran headlines condemning the decision, while politicians across Louisiana denounced what they called an assault on states' rights. Governor Jimmy Davis, a country music singer turned politician, immediately called the state legislature into special session to find ways to circumvent the federal order. "We will use every legal means at our disposal," he declared on television, "to prevent the destruction of our way of life." But it wasn't just politicians who were outraged. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had grown up in a segregated society and knew no other way of life, felt their world was being turned upside down. White parents began organizing boycotts, threatening to pull their children out of any school that admitted black students. Some talked about closing the public school system entirely rather than allow integration. Judge Wright, meanwhile, was facing personal consequences for his decision. Death threats arrived at his office daily. His phone rang at all hours with anonymous callers promising violence. Local restaurants refused to serve him, and longtime friends crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. The social isolation was perhaps harder to bear than the threats. Yet Wright pressed forward. He knew that the law was on his side, even if popular opinion was not. More importantly, he understood that the constitutional rights of black children in New Orleans were at stake. These weren't abstract legal principles he was defending, but the fundamental human dignity of thousands of young people who had been denied equal educational opportunities for generations. Throughout the summer of 1960, Wright worked tirelessly with federal officials, civil rights attorneys, and school administrators to develop a practical plan for desegregation. The resistance was overwhelming. The Orleans Parish School Board, despite being under federal court order, dragged their feet at every opportunity. They claimed they needed more time to prepare, more resources to implement the changes, more community input to ensure a smooth transition. Wright saw through these delaying tactics. He had been a federal judge long enough to recognize bureaucratic obstruction when he saw it. In August, he issued a more specific order. Desegregation would begin immediately with the first-grade classes in 4 previously all-white schools. The choice of first graders was strategic, as Wright believed younger children would be less affected by the racial prejudices of their elders. The school board appealed Wright's decision to higher courts, hoping to delay implementation. But the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Wright's order, and the Supreme Court declined to review the case. There would be no more delays, no more legal maneuvering. Come September, New Orleans public schools would be integrated. A 6-year-old named Ruby. As the legal battles raged in courtrooms and the political fights intensified in the state capitol, a quiet revolution was taking place in the homes of black families across New Orleans. Parents who had dreamed of better educational opportunities for their children suddenly faced a momentous decision. Should they volunteer their child to be among the first to integrate the white schools? The risks were enormous. These children would face hostility, isolation, and possibly violence. They would be walking into hostile territory every day, carrying the hopes and fears of an entire community on their small shoulders. Yet for many parents, the opportunity was too important to pass up. This was their chance to break the cycle of educational inequality that had constrained their families for generations. Among those families was the Bridges household in the Ninth Ward. Lucille and Abin Bridges had been following the legal proceedings closely, discussing in hushed tones whether they should put their 6-year-old daughter Ruby forward as a candidate for integration. Ruby was bright, confident, and remarkably mature for her age. She had passed the entrance exam for the white schools with flying colors. But the decision was agonizing. Lucille Bridges knew that choosing to send Ruby to an integrated school would fundamentally change their daughter's life. Ruby would no longer be just another child in the neighborhood. She would become a symbol, a target, and a pioneer all at once. She's so young, Lucille confided her husband one evening as they watched Ruby play in their small backyard. Is it fair to ask her to carry this burden? Abin Bridges, who worked as a gas station attendant and knew firsthand the limitations that segregation placed on black advancement, was more resolute. This is her chance, he said. This is all our children's chance. Someone has to be first. The family prayed about the decision, sought counsel from their pastor, and talked to other parents facing the same dilemma. In the end, they decided that the opportunity was too important to let pass. They would trust in God, in the federal marshals who had been assigned to protect the children, and in their daughter's remarkable inner strength. Ruby herself, at 6 years old, didn't fully understand the historical significance of what was happening. To her, it was simply a chance to go to a new school, one that was supposed to be better than her neighborhood school. She was excited about the prospect of new teachers, new classrooms, and new experiences. The innocence of her perspective was both heartbreaking and inspiring. While adults across the city argued about constitutional law, states' rights, and racial theory, Ruby was simply a little girl who wanted to learn and grow and have friends. Her childlike faith that people were fundamentally good would be tested in ways that no 6-year-old should ever have to endure. November 14, 1960. The morning of November 14, 1960, dawned gray and overcast, as if the very sky reflected the tension that had been building in New Orleans for months. Ruby Bridges woke up in her family's small house and prepared for what she thought would be just another day at her new school. She had no way of knowing that she was about to become one of the most famous children in American history. Ruby's mother had dressed her carefully in a white shirt, dark skirt, and white shoes. The outfit was simple but neat, chosen deliberately to present Ruby as the well-behaved, respectable child she was. As they prepared to leave the house, federal marshals arrived to escort Ruby to William Frantz Elementary School. The presence of the marshals should have been Ruby's first clue that this day would be different from any other. But at 6 years old, she found their tall, serious figures more interesting than frightening. They seemed like important people, and she felt important being with them. The drive to William Frantz Elementary took them through neighborhoods Ruby had never seen before. The houses were larger here, the lawns more carefully manicured. This was a different world from the Ninth Ward where she had grown up, and Ruby pressed her nose to the car window to take in all the new sights. But as they approached the school, the scene became increasingly chaotic. Crowds of white protesters had gathered outside the building, their faces contorted with rage. They carried signs with words Ruby couldn't read, but somehow understood were meant to hurt her. The shouting grew louder as their car approached the school entrance. "Stay close to us," one of the marshals told Ruby as they prepared to get out of the car. "Don't look at the crowd. Just look straight ahead and walk." Ruby nodded, her small hand gripping her book bag tightly. She could feel the eyes of hundreds of people on her as she walked up the steps to the school. The shouting was so loud she could barely hear her own footsteps on the pavement. Inside the school, the atmosphere was eerily quiet. The hallways that should have been filled with the chatter and laughter of children were empty except for Ruby and her escorts. As they walked toward what would be her classroom, Ruby began to understand that something very unusual was happening. The white parents, in response to Ruby's enrollment, had organized a massive boycott. They had pulled their children out of William Frantz Elementary rather than allow them to attend school with a black child. What should have been a building full of learning and childhood joy had become a battleground in the larger war over civil rights. Ruby's teacher, Barbara Henry, was waiting in the classroom. Henry was a young white woman from Boston who had volunteered to teach Ruby despite the controversy surrounding integration. She greeted Ruby with a warm smile, determined to provide her with the best education possible regardless of the circumstances. For the entire first day, Ruby was the only student in her classroom. She sat at her desk, opened her books, and began to learn, while outside the protesters continued their angry demonstration. It was a surreal scene. One small black girl receiving a one-on-one education from a dedicated teacher, while hundreds of adults raged against the very idea of her presence in their school. This pattern would continue for months. Every morning, Ruby would be escorted to school by federal marshals while angry crowds hurled insults and threats. Every day, she would sit in her classroom with Mrs. Henry, sometimes as the only student in the entire school. And every afternoon, she would walk back through the gauntlet of protesters to return home. The psychological pressure on such a young child was enormous. Yet Ruby displayed a remarkable resilience that amazed everyone who witnessed it. She never cried in front of the protesters, never showed fear, never complained about the treatment she was receiving. Her quiet dignity in the face of such hostility became a powerful symbol of the civil rights movement. The judge under siege. While Ruby Bridges was facing down angry mobs on her way to school each morning, Judge J. Skelly Wright was fighting his own battle to maintain the rule of law in the face of massive resistance. The white community's response to his desegregation order had been even more extreme than he had anticipated. The school boycott was just the beginning. White parents organized alternative private schools practically overnight, determined to ensure their children never shared a classroom with black students. Local businesses donated supplies and classroom space for these impromptu institutions. Churches opened their doors to serve as temporary schools. The white community was essentially creating a parallel educational system to circumvent Wright's order. Meanwhile, the harassment of Judge Wright intensified. The death threats became more specific and more frequent. Someone painted communist on the wall of his house. His car tires were slashed repeatedly. Local restaurants refused to serve him, and he found himself increasingly isolated from the community he had served for years. The psychological toll was immense. Wright had grown up in New Orleans, had deep roots in the community, and had always seen himself as serving his hometown. Now that same hometown was treating him as an enemy. Old friends avoided him at social gatherings. Professional colleagues distanced themselves from his controversial decisions. Even his own extended family was divided about his actions. But Wright's commitment to constitutional law never wavered. He understood that he wasn't just enforcing a court order. He was defending the fundamental principle that federal law supersedes local custom. If communities could simply ignore federal court decisions they didn't like, then the entire structure of American democracy would collapse. In December 1960, Wright faced his greatest challenge yet. The Louisiana state legislature, at Governor Davis's urging, passed a series of laws designed to prevent school desegregation. These laws attempted to remove control of New Orleans schools from local authorities and place them under state control, with explicit instructions to maintain segregation. The confrontation that followed was a direct test of federal versus state authority. Wright issued injunctions blocking implementation of the state laws, arguing that they were unconstitutional attempts to circumvent federal authority. Governor Davis responded by threatening to close all public schools in New Orleans rather than allow integration to continue. The standoff escalated when state officials attempted to physically take control of the New Orleans schools. Wright responded by holding several state officials in contempt of court and threatening them with federal prosecution. The battle lines were clearly drawn: federal law versus state defiance, constitutional rights versus local custom. Throughout this legal and political warfare, Wright remained focused on the central issue: ensuring that black children in New Orleans receive the equal educational opportunities guaranteed by the Constitution. He knew that Ruby Bridges and the few other black children who had integrated white schools were depending on his protection. If he backed down in the face of local pressure, their safety and their rights would be compromised. The judge also understood the broader historical significance of what was happening in New Orleans. The success or failure of school desegregation in his city would send a message across the South about whether federal civil rights decisions could be effectively resisted. If massive resistance succeeded in New Orleans, it would encourage similar defiance in other communities facing integration orders. The loneliness of pioneers. As winter settled over New Orleans, the daily routine at William Frantz Elementary took on a surreal quality. Each morning, Ruby Bridges would arrive at school escorted by federal marshals, walk past angry protesters, and enter a building that had been virtually emptied by the white boycott. She would spend her day in a classroom with Mrs. Henry, receiving an excellent education, but missing out on the social interactions that are such an important part of childhood development. The isolation was profound. Ruby had no classmates to play with at recess, no friends to eat lunch with, no study partners for group projects. At 6 years old, she was experiencing a loneliness that few adults could comprehend, let alone endure with such grace. Yet Ruby's response to this isolation was remarkable. Rather than becoming bitter or withdrawn, she seemed to develop an even stronger sense of purpose. She threw herself into her studies with Mrs. Henry, excelling in reading, mathematics, and science. Her teacher later recalled being amazed by Ruby's intellectual curiosity and her determination to learn despite the extraordinary circumstances. Mrs. Henry herself was facing considerable pressure. As the only white teacher willing to teach integrated classes, she had become a target for community hostility. Anonymous callers threatened her regularly. Her car was vandalized. Some white residents treated her as a traitor to her race for her willingness to teach a black child. But Henry, like Ruby, displayed remarkable courage. She had come to New Orleans from Massachusetts specifically to be part of the integration process, believing deeply in the importance of equal education. She was determined to provide Ruby with the same high-quality instruction she would give any student, regardless of the political controversy surrounding their classroom. The relationship between Ruby and Mrs. Henry became one of the most positive aspects of the entire integration experience. In their quiet classroom, removed from the angry crowds and political battles, they formed a genuine teacher-student bond based on mutual respect and shared commitment to learning. Mrs. Henry later said that teaching Ruby was one of the most rewarding experiences of her teaching career. Meanwhile, Ruby's parents were dealing with their own challenges. Abin Bridges lost his job at the gas station when his boss discovered that Ruby was a child integrating the white school. Local stores refused to serve the family. Anonymous callers threatened violence against the entire Bridges household. The financial pressure was enormous. With Abin out of work and local businesses boycotting the family, the Bridges struggled to make ends meet, yet they never wavered in their support for Ruby's education. They understood that their daughter was carrying not just her own hopes for the future, but the dreams of countless black families who had been denied educational opportunities for generations. Lucille Bridges spent countless hours explaining to Ruby why some people were angry about her attending school with white children. She tried to help her daughter understand that the hatred directed at them wasn't personal, but was rooted in a system of racial prejudice that had existed long before Ruby was born. Ruby's responses to these conversations revealed a wisdom far beyond her years. She seemed to intuitively understand that the protesters were wrong, that their anger came from fear and ignorance rather than legitimate grievance. Her ability to maintain her innocence and optimism in the face of such hostility was perhaps her greatest strength. The wider battle, While Ruby Bridges was making history at William Frantz Elementary, Judge Wright was fighting an increasingly complex legal battle to maintain federal authority over school desegregation. The resistance to his orders had evolved from simple defiance to sophisticated legal and political maneuvering designed to circumvent federal law while maintaining the appearance of compliance. Governor Davis and the Louisiana legislature had developed a multi-pronged strategy to defeat integration. They passed laws transferring control of New Orleans schools to state authorities who were explicitly committed to maintaining segregation. They threatened to cut off funding to any school that admitted black students. They attempted to prosecute federal officials for interfering with state education policy. Wright responded to each challenge with careful legal reasoning and unwavering determination. He issued detailed orders explaining why each state action violated federal constitutional law. He threatened contempt citations against officials who refused to comply with his decisions. He worked closely with Justice Department attorneys to ensure that federal law would be enforced regardless of local resistance. The battle became increasingly personal. Wright's judicial colleagues in Louisiana, many of whom disagreed with his integration orders, began to isolate him professionally. Legal conferences that he had attended for years suddenly became uncomfortable gatherings where he was treated as an outsider. Some of his fellow judges openly criticized his decisions in public forums. The criticism was particularly painful because it came from people Wright respected professionally. These were not random protesters or political opportunists, but experienced jurists who argued that Wright was overstepping his authority and imposing his personal views on unwilling communities. The professional isolation added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. Yet Wright found support from unexpected sources. Federal judges in other jurisdictions, particularly those who had faced similar integration battles, reached out to offer encouragement and advice. Constitutional law scholars at universities across the country wrote articles supporting his legal reasoning. Civil rights organizations praised his courage in standing up to massive resistance. Most importantly, Wright received quiet support from some members of the New Orleans legal community who agreed with his decisions but were afraid to say so publicly. Lawyers would approach him privately to express their admiration for his courage. Court clerks and federal employees assured him that they supported his enforcement of constitutional law. This underground support network helped Wright maintain his resolve during the darkest moments of the integration crisis. Knowing that some people in his community understood and appreciated what he was trying to accomplish made the public hostility somewhat more bearable. The judge also drew strength from his regular observations of Ruby Bridges and the other children involved in integration. Seeing their quiet courage in the face of such hostility reminded him daily of why his legal battle was so important. These children represented the future of American democracy, and their right to equal education was worth defending regardless of the personal cost. Breaking point. By February 1961, the standoff over school integration in New Orleans had reached a crisis point. The white boycott had been largely successful in emptying the integrated schools of white students. Alternative private schools were thriving with community support and donations. State officials were openly defying federal court orders while claiming they were following proper legal procedures. Judge Wright realized that half measures were no longer sufficient. The organized resistance to integration had become so sophisticated that it was effectively nullifying his court orders while maintaining a veneer of legal compliance. He needed to take more dramatic action to enforce federal law. On February 15th, Wright issued his most sweeping order yet. He commanded the Orleans Parish School Board to actively recruit white students back to the integrated schools. He ordered state officials to stop interfering with federal desegregation plans. Most controversially, he threatened to hold the entire school board in contempt if they didn't take concrete steps to make integration successful. The reaction was explosive. Governor Davis called Wright's order judicial tyranny and vowed to resist it with every legal means available. Local newspapers ran editorials comparing Wright to a dictator imposing his will on an unwilling population. Angry crowds gathered outside the federal courthouse, calling for Wright's impeachment. But Wright had calculated that this was the moment to force a final confrontation. He understood that gradual compliance would never work in the face of such organized resistance. Either federal law would be enforced completely, or it would be meaningless. There could be no middle ground in a battle over constitutional rights. The federal government, now under the new Kennedy administration, faced a critical decision. Would they support Wright's aggressive enforcement of integration orders, or would they seek some kind of compromise that might reduce tensions but also weaken federal authority? Attorney General Robert Kennedy, after consulting with his brother President John F. Kennedy, decided to fully support Wright's position. Federal marshals were reinforced in New Orleans. Justice Department attorneys were instructed to support Wright's orders with additional legal resources. The message was clear. Federal law will be enforced regardless of local resistance. This federal backing gave Wright the support he needed to press forward. He scheduled contempt hearings for school board members who continued to resist integration. He threatened financial penalties against state officials who interfered with federal orders. He made it clear that he was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to ensure compliance with constitutional law. The pressure on local officials became enormous. They faced a choice between continued defiance, which could result in federal prosecution and imprisonment, or compliance with integration orders that would enrage their political constituencies. Most chose compliance, recognizing that the federal government was serious about enforcement. Small victories. As spring arrived in New Orleans, there were signs that the massive resistance to school integration was finally beginning to weaken. A few white families, tired of the disruption to their children's education and uncomfortable with the extreme rhetoric of the protesters, began to return their children to the integrated schools. Ruby Bridges was no longer completely alone in her classroom. Several white children had rejoined her class, and while the interactions were initially tentative and awkward, they gradually began to develop normal childhood friendships. For Ruby, having classmates again was a tremendous relief after months of isolation. Mrs. Henry worked carefully to create a classroom environment where children of different races could learn together comfortably. She focused on academic subjects that brought out the best in all her students, while also addressing the racial tensions that inevitably arose from time to time. Her skill as a teacher was instrumental in making integration work at the classroom level. The changes were gradual and sometimes subtle. White children who had initially been suspicious or fearful of their black classmates began to discover that they had more in common than they had differences. They shared interests in games, books, and activities that transcended racial boundaries. The natural friendliness of children began to overcome the prejudices they had absorbed from adult society. Ruby herself played a crucial role in making integration successful. Her quiet dignity, intellectual curiosity, and genuine friendliness made it difficult for even the most prejudiced white children to maintain their negative attitudes. She never responded to rudeness with rudeness, never let bitterness creep into her interactions with others. Judge Wright watched these developments with satisfaction and relief. The success of integration at the classroom level vindicated his belief that children, when given the opportunity, could transcend the racial prejudices of their parents. The daily evidence that black and white children could learn together effectively undermined the arguments of segregationists who claimed that integration was impossible. But Wright also understood that the broader battle was far from over. While a few schools in New Orleans were successfully integrating, the vast majority of Southern schools remained completely segregated. The resistance to integration in other communities was often even more intense than what New Orleans had experienced. The judge began to receive requests from civil rights attorneys in other jurisdictions who were facing similar battles. His experience in New Orleans had made him a recognized expert in the practical challenges of implementing school desegregation. He shared his knowledge freely, understanding that the success of integration nationwide depended on learning from both the failures and successes in individual communities. Wright also began to speak publicly about the importance of federal judges maintaining their independence in civil rights cases. He argued that judges had a special responsibility to protect constitutional rights, even when doing so was unpopular with local communities. His speeches and writings became influential in shaping how other federal judges approached civil rights cases. The price of justice. By the end of Ruby's first year at William Frantz Elementary, it was clear that school integration in New Orleans had survived its most serious challenges. While the process had been painful and the resistance fierce, federal law had ultimately prevailed over local defiance. The precedent established in New Orleans would influence integration battles across the South for years to come. But the victory came at an enormous personal cost for those who made it possible. Judge Wright's reputation in his hometown was permanently damaged. Many longtime friends never spoke to him again. His social life was severely restricted, as many New Orleans establishments continued to refuse him service. The stress of the integration battle had taken a toll on his health and his family relationships. Ruby Bridges and her family also paid a heavy price for their pioneering role. The threats and harassment continued long after Ruby's enrollment became routine. Abin Bridges struggled to find steady employment, as many employers remained reluctant to hire the father of the child who had integrated white schools. The family faced years of financial hardship as a result of their commitment to equal education. Mrs. Henry faced her own challenges. After her year teaching Ruby, she found it difficult to get teaching positions in the South. Many school districts consider her too controversial because of her role in integration. She eventually returned to New England, where her commitment to civil rights was better appreciated. Yet all three, Wright, Ruby, and Mrs. Henry, later said they had no regrets about their roles in the integration of New Orleans schools. They understood that they had participated in a historic transformation of American society, and they took pride in having contributed to expanding educational opportunities for all children. Wright continued to serve as a federal judge for many more years, handling numerous civil rights cases with the same commitment to constitutional law that he had shown during the integration crisis. He became known as one of the most effective federal judges in the South for enforcing civil rights legislation. His legal decisions helped establish important precedents that protected voting rights, employment opportunities, and access to public accommodations for Black Americans. Ruby Bridges graduated from an integrated high school and went on to college, becoming a successful adult who used her unique childhood experience to advocate for civil rights education. She established a foundation dedicated to teaching children about the importance of tolerance and equality. Her story became a symbol of courage and perseverance in the face of injustice. Mrs. Henry continued her teaching career in Massachusetts, always remaining proud of her year in New Orleans. She stayed in touch with Ruby throughout her life, maintaining the special bond they had formed during that difficult but transformative school year. Her example inspired other teachers to see their profession as potentially contributing to social justice.